Welcome back. In this session, we'll be exploring Azure Storage accounts and creating an SFTP service. On completion of this session, you'll have the ability to receive data via SFTP, which can then be used by Azure Integration Services or your own integration platform. So how does Microsoft Azure SFTP service work? Well, firstly, we need to understand there are a number of services Azure offers with regards to data and integration. It offers things such as logic apps. These allow for visual creation of workflows using triggers and actions. If you're interested in hearing more around logic apps and what they have to offer, check out the link above, where I covered this in a previous session. Secondly, we have Azure's Data Factory. This is a scalable, serverless service which operates as Azure's cloud ETL service. It's all around receiving data, translating data, and forwarding that on to other systems and integration. If you're interested in learning more about Azure's Data Factory, I have a separate video focusing on this, which would also work well with the SFTP service we're going to be exploring in this session. Lastly, regards to the SFTP service itself, this is largely offered from a storage account within Azure. And it's a storage account where our focus will be today. Within Azure, it's the storage account that contains all the files, blobs and tables. You can think of this almost like a traditional server. From creating the storage account, we'll then look to create a storage container for our files and our data. Here you can create one or multiple, and it's also at this level where you can allow permissions per user based on things like reads, writes, and deletes. And then within the container, this is where you'll store your files. Now the structure here is really around the data. When it comes to SFTP, this needs to be enabled at the storage account level. This is completed by enabling SFTP and hierarchical namespace. Both of these options we'll cover in the demo today, so just for now, remember that these are required. Once we have completed the setup, we can then create our user. And it's our user who will then be connecting to the storage account using SFTP and uploading, deleting, reading data. For this session, we'll be looking to use WinSCP for the demonstration purposes. However, you can use anything that connects to SFTP via this service. So there are plenty of other tools and services that can connect to the storage account using SFTP. Now we understand the concepts and the naming conventions, let's log into Azure and build our SFTP service. Now we've logged into our Azure portal, it's from here we need to create, firstly, our storage account. Here we can hit storage accounts and simply create storage account. Here we need to choose our resource group. I covered this in some of the previous videos, and it's really around grouping and shielding those resources. So for this purpose, I've got one set up called demos. We then need to give our storage account a name. So here, I'm going to call this SFTP demo service. We're going to set this up in Europe South, and everything else here is absolutely fine. I'm going to turn redundancy off because I don't need it for the case of this particular example. Obviously, if you're building something that's production or you need significantly more redundancy or uptime, etc., then you need to ensure that that is followed. We can then hit next. And it's here where we've got our various options with regards to hierarchical namespace and our access protocols here. So by default, because it's Azure, it enables REST API operations here. For us, in order to build our SFTP service, we're going to enable hierarchical namespace and SFTP. At this point now, we can then hit review and create. This is now going to start validating, and it's at this point now where we've got displayed what our storage account name will be on completion, and also the various options that we've got with regards to security, networking, and the protocols. The main piece here is that we've got hierarchical namespace enabled and also SFTP. Let's now hit create, and this will now start creating and deploying our new storage account. After a short period of time, our deployment will be complete, and then we can go to our resource. Here now we can see that we've got hierarchical namespace enabled and also SFTP. From here now we've got our data storage on the left where we can now create our containers. So let's do that now. So we can click here, we can create a new container, and we can give our container a name. Now in this case we could be setting up something to receive data from SAP, iDocs for instance, and if we're creating this particular service for a particular customer for instance, we may want to be very simple here and create an inbound folder. I say an inbound folder, I mean container. And then we may also want to create a separate container for outbound. And this, because we're creating with separate containers, gives us more control on privileges and access rights on those containers. Now we've done that, we need to look at setting up users. Setting up users is fairly straightforward. On the left-hand side under settings, we've got SFTP. If we simply click this, here we can see that we've got various different options. We can add a user, we can disable local users, and we can also disable SFTP. So at any point, if we're setting up this storage account, users, etc., and we're also connecting to this storage account using other services, not via SFTP, and we later want to disable that, then we can disable that by selecting Disable SFTP. Also, just to make you aware from a chargeability perspective, Azure charge at the point that you've got this enabled. So we've now got SFTP enabled on this particular server. If we want to disable that so that we're not being charged for that particular service, we can literally do that at a click of a button. Okay, so let's set up or create a user. So we're going to add a local user. We're going to give this user a name, so we can call this SAP client. And then we've got two options. We can have a password or we can use a key pair. Now, both of these are very strong, are great for that perspective, but we're just going to create a password in this case. Now, when you do that, you don't generate the password yourself. Azure will do that, and then you'll have a sort of password sort of hashed, so to speak, in order to create your connection in SFTP. So let's now hit next. Here now we can specify the containers that we want the user to have access to. So for this, we're just going to set up on inbound and outbound because we've got both of those. And then for each of those containers, as we discussed before, we can now select different permissions for each of those containers. Now, because we're looking at operating this for an SAP sort of user, I suppose, if we want to call it that, we're going to give them read, write, list, and delete and creation as options there. Now, you always have to be very careful with what you enable and what you allow, because obviously you've got things like modify ownership, permissions, and some more higher level permissions there that you should be very wary about issuing out. We're going to do the same for the other one as well. Again, we're only doing this for test purposes anyway. And we can also set up a home landing directory so that when they log in, it can default to a particular directory we want to set them up for there. Now, in this case, we're not going to worry too much about that, and we're just going to add the user. At that point now, that's created the user, and here is where we have the password that we're going to copy so that we've got that ready for when we need it when we're creating our connection within WinSCP. So now this is done, we're now ready to connect to the service. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull up WinSCP. We're going to connect and we're going to drop an XML IDOC into the inbound container. And then we can log back into Azure to see that that is there and it is visible. I now have WinSCP open. So here we now need to put the host in. So simply here, the host is going to be copied over. So if I grab that from here, we can pop the host in here. SFTP by default is always port 22, so that's absolutely fine. We then have our user. So above here, we can see that we've got, after the @ sign, that is our host. And before the @ sign is our user. And we've got container name in here because actually it is technically two separate connections to connect to each container. So if we go inbound, and then we can, just going to paste in the password here, which I stored from the previous screen. We can then hit save, just save that password for the time being, and then I can log in, cache that. There we go. So we're now here. So I can now grab this IDOC file that I've got here, and I can drop this onto our SFTP server. Now, if we then wanted to connect to the outbound in order to connect to there to collect our outbound files, for instance, because this SFTP server from a demo perspective is used to bridge between SAP and between another service provider. And that could be a WMS system, it could be anything really there, an ERP system, etc. So we'd have two separate connections in order to be able to connect for the inbound and the outbound. So let's get rid of SFTP there. And from here, we can then go into our containers and we can browse. So if we go inbound, and here we can now see that we've got that file. So as simple as that, we have now basically created an SFTP service, and we've got the ability now to be able to connect to it and drop data and files. And we can also collect that data and those files as well. So if I bring WinSCP back up and we delete this file, yes, we want to delete it. We do a refresh now. There we go. We've got no blobs, no files there at all. So now we've got this set up, we can then connect a client system to this in order to process those files. Or if we were using something in Azure Data Factory, we could trigger a process off in order to consume that. Same with Logic Apps as well. So there's lots of possibilities here. And what this service does in Azure is make creating an SFTP service really simple. You haven't got to worry about building servers, and the service is just there and it works. Thank you for joining me for this session. Hopefully it's been useful, and now you know how to create an SFTP service within Azure. If there's anything else that you would like to know, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or comment on a video within YouTube, and I'll do my best to help out. I'm constantly putting out new content, so if you want the latest, feel free to subscribe.